Everyone knows this sound. It's the mysterious little sound you hear when you discover a secret in the Legend of Zelda games. But why does it sound the way that it does? Koji Kondo, composer and sound designer for Nintendo, created this motif along with the rest of the music for The Legend of Zelda on the NES, and it has appeared in many, if not all, Zelda titles since. But what makes it sound the way it does? Mysterious, dreamy, eerie, all rolled into one. Welcome to Nerd Notes, the series in which I analyze various musical aspects of video games to see what makes them tick. Okay, let's look at the notes that make up this motif, motif being a musical idea. The motif is comprised of two parts, the first descending part and then the second ascending part. It starts on a G and descends a semitone to an F sharp, then goes down to a D sharp or E flat, and then finally to an A. The first thing I notice about these notes is that the D sharp, F sharp, and A make up a diminished triad, which is itself part of a larger diminished scale. What the heck is a diminished scale, you might ask? Well, I'm glad you did. Diminished scales come in two flavors, half-whole and whole-half. These titles refer to the patterns used to construct the scale. A half-whole diminished scale starts on the root and proceeds to ascend up a half step, followed by a whole step, followed again by a half step, half step, etc., until you reach the root again. The whole half diminished scale is simply the opposite. It starts by ascending up a whole step rather than a half step and then alternates accordingly. This scale has a couple of unique properties. The first is that it's an 8-note scale rather than the normal 7-note scale that we're used to. The second is to do with the symmetry of the diminished scale. A symmetrical scale is a scale based on a simple, repeatable pattern. The simplest example of this would be a chromatic scale. We could say the pattern it is based on is up a semitone. You start at the root, go up a semitone to the next note, up a semitone to the next note, etc., until you reach the root again. And, as we've established, the pattern a diminished scale is based on is up a semitone, up a whole tone for half-whole, and up a whole tone, up a semitone for whole-half. Because of the repetitive, pattern-based nature of symmetrical scales, they don't feel like they have a home or a tonic. We describe this as non-functional, as opposed to functional scales like the major scale, from which they behave very differently. If you were to play a mode of a major scale, that mode would have a very different sound to the initial major scale. It has a different tonality and feel altogether. For example, if we play a C major or C Ionian scale, but start it from the second degree, the sound that we get is very different. We are now playing a D Dorian scale. But if we play a mode of a non-functional scale, like the diminished scale, there is little to no difference in tonality or feel. A C diminished scale sounds like an E flat diminished scale, which sounds like a G flat diminished scale, which sounds like an A diminished scale. Let's very quickly listen to a mode of a major scale and juxtapose that with the mode of a diminished scale. You can hear a distinct tonality change from C major to D Dorian. The same cannot be said for C diminished to E flat diminished. This gives symmetrical scales a very ambiguous, often tense and discordant sound to them because there is never a feeling of resolution or home. That in mind, we can use diminished scales, or indeed any symmetrical scale, to create mystery, intrigue, or tension in our music. Here's a few examples I wrote while messing around with a diminished scale. A few short ones that could be used to a similar effect as the Zelda one, and some longer, more background-like music that could be used to create a mood in a scene. As a side note, the symmetrical nature of these scales makes them a lot easier to learn on your instrument. Once you've learned a C half-whole diminished scale, you've also learned E flat half whole, G flat half whole, A half whole, as well as C sharp whole half, E whole half, G whole half, and B flat whole half. That's a whole 8 scales for the price of one. Thanks, maths! Another cool thing about symmetrical scales is how they can be represented visually. If we draw a circle and put the numbers 0 to 11 around it, much like a clock, to represent each of the 12 notes we have, 0 being the root, and if we go all the way around the circle, 0 is the octave above that root. If we go exactly halfway around the circle, we will find the halfway point between those two notes. This also splits the circle in half. That halfway point is a tritone, or a diminished fifth away from the upper and lower octaves. If we find the halfway point in between those two notes, we get 3 and 9. This splits the circle in half horizontally, those two notes being exactly a tritone apart as well. We now have 4 notes, all evenly spaced around a circle. Not only are the first and third and second and fourth notes exactly a tritone apart, each note is exactly a minor third from the previous. Are you starting to see why this might be called symmetrical? The more savvy among you might have noticed that the chord created by stacking minor thirds is in fact a diminished chord. So we're halfway there. You just need 2 more lines to complete the diminished scale. Let's start with a half-whole diminished scale. The root of our scale is 0, so we need to go a half step away to 1 and cut the circle in half again. That gives us 1 and 7. The next note would be a whole step away from 1, which is 3, but we've already got that covered. So the next is a half step from 3 to 4. Cut the circle and it gives us 4 and 10. That's our half-whole diminished scale. 0, 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, 9, 10. Or, as notes, that would be C, D flat, E flat, E, G flat, G, A, B flat. We can also do the same for whole half, but I want to point out something first that I found kind of interesting. Take a look at the pattern we've made. This is the original diminished chord, and here's our diminished scale. What do you notice? Check this out. This second cross we added to complete the diminished scale is exactly the same as the original diminished chord, but now it's off by a semitone. So that means this diminished scale is simply 2 diminished chords a semitone apart. Are we getting the symmetrical part yet? So if we want to make a whole half diminished scale, we simply rotate the cross a whole step away from the original rather than a half step. Pretty nifty, eh? Okay, so that's symmetrical diminished scales. Back to the motif. We have a section of a diminished scale played in a descending fashion, in fact, outlining a diminished triad, and as we established, the symmetrical nature of this scale/triad creates a motif with an open, ambiguous tonality to it. I find this interesting because although you have solved a problem, the mysterious nature of the motif implies that there is yet more to be solved. Compare this to the sound that Mario makes when he hits a box and gets a coin. This is a very final, triumphant sound. You did a thing, and you got a thing, and now you're done. But the Zelda one is more like, you did a thing, you got a thing, but maybe there's still more to come? Which is perfect for a game that is all about solving puzzles and navigating long, mysterious dungeons. Okay, so the second part is, surprise, another symmetrical. Well, it's not a scale, it's an arpeggio. This time it's an augmented chord. This chord is built on major thirds. So if we start at C and go up a major third, we get to E, and then up another major third, we get to G sharp, and then finally we arrive back at C after jumping up another major third. You'll notice that because the intervals between the notes are larger than that of a diminished chord, a major third being larger than a minor third, the result is less notes before you get back to the root. We can also plot this on our symmetry circle. Start at 0 and move clockwise around the circle a major third. That's 4 semitones. Then another major third clockwise, and then finally a major third back to the root. And we've got ourselves a peace symbol. Remember that, augmented chords are the chords of peace. We can also do the same thing we did with the cross that represented a diminished chord. Simply rotate this peace symbol a whole step away and we create a whole tone scale. This is a scale built on the pattern of up, can you guess it? A whole tone or a whole step. And as you can see, it cuts the symmetry circle into 6 even pieces, like a tasty pizza. That's 6 notes all evenly spaced a tone away from each other. This scale is going to have similar properties to the diminished scale in that the modes will sound very similar to each other, making one difficult to distinguish from another, but making them easier to learn on your instrument. There are only really 2 different whole tone scales, one starting from C and one starting from C sharp. Starting from D, E, F sharp, G, or A sharp will yield you the same scale as starting from C, and starting from D sharp, F, G, A, or B will yield the same scale as starting from C sharp. Do you recognize this sound? What about now?
I remember it like it was yesterday.
That's right, the musical trope you hear in movies or TV when people are reminiscing or dreaming is simply an ascending whole tone scale with a little bit of reverb. So, Koji Kondo has taken advantage of the mysterious, ambiguous, dreamy nature of these two symmetrical scales to create a motif that makes us think, oh, I found something, but maybe there's more to this? It's pretty fantastic. Why not try using symmetrical scales in your own compositions to add some mystery or tension? You don't have to exclusively use these scales, but depending on the context and the mood you're trying to invoke, they might just do the trick. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and if there are any musical aspects of games that you'd like to see analysed. If you enjoyed this, then go ahead and like the video, and if you want to see more content like this, then consider subscribing to my channel and becoming a patron over on patreon.com. I'll see you next time.